If Africa in the 1920s was marked by revival and Indigenous awakening, Asia was a landscape of transition. Long-established mission fields were expanding, but also changing, and the old assumptions of Western dominance were being questioned. Long-established mission fields were expanding, but also changing. I'm Laura Lee Siemens, and this is the Church History Podcast. The mission movement in China was well established, as we've discussed in previous episodes. In the mid-19th century, Hudson Taylor reshaped Protestant missions in China by redirecting attention away from the familiar coastal treaty ports towards the vast interior. When Taylor first arrived in Shanghai in 1854, he quickly began traveling beyond the foreign enclaves, adopting Chinese dress and a simple lifestyle to identify more closely with the ordinary people in China. The inland vision became formalized in 1865 with the founding of the China Inland Missions, created specifically to bring the gospel to China's unreached provinces. I've covered the story of Hudson Taylor in the past, and I'll put a link to that in the show notes. We've also talked about Lottie Moon in the past. Charlotte Diggs Lottie Moon was an American Southern missionary whose life became bound to China, where she served from 1873 until she died in 1912. On July 7th in 1873, Moon sailed for China in early September and arrived at the North China Mission in the Shandong province. During her early years from 1873 to 1875, Moon focused on teaching in boys' and later girls' schools while steadily expanding her evangelical work. The Boxer Rebellion of the 1900s brought intense danger and disruption, but Moon remained committed. She continued to evangelize villages, train new missionaries, and organize women's work amid the famine, political upheaval, and persistent anti-Christian hostility. During the severe famine of 1912, Moon shared her food with starving Chinese Christians and eventually became malnourished herself. She was placed on a ship bound for the United States, but died aboard the ship December 24th, 1912 in Kobe Harbor, Japan. During the 1920s, while mission work and revival were spreading across Africa, which we talked about in our last episode, God was also working in Asia, and he was continuing the work of Hudson and Lottie and many more, even though they were no longer alive. This is the Church History Podcast, and I'm your host, Laura Lee Siemens, and we're telling the story of the church in chronological order. We started with the life of Jesus Christ, and we have traveled through many centuries. We've talked about the Inquisitions and the Crusades and many other important parts of our church history. In our last season, we talked about World War I, and in this season, we're talking about the time period between World War I and World War II. Today, we're going to explore the story of Hubert L. Sone, an American Southern Methodist missionary who arrived in China in 1920, right at the height of the American missionary involvement. Serving in cities, Sone's ministry unfolded during a period of great opportunity, but also growing tension in the Chinese society. But first, where it all started, in the spring of 1892 in Denton, Texas, a small but growing town perched on the northern edge of the prairie. The air smells of red dust and freshly turned soil, and life moves at a pace of horse hooves and church bells. Denton is not yet a city of highways and universities. It's a place of dirt roads, modern storefronts, and neighbors who know each other by name and by reputation. Texas is young. It's barely 4 decades removed from statehood. Families here live close to the land, shaped by hard work and deep-rooted faith. Sunday is sacred. Church isn't just worship, it's community. It's where you get your news. It's where you get your comfort. It's how you survive. You'll hear hymns drifting out of the buildings, carried across open fields where cotton and corn are growing under the Texas sun. And it was into this world that Hubert Sone is born, welcomed by his parents, William and Martha Sone, into a life that will be marked by discipline, belief, and endurance. William works with his hands and Martha keeps the home. Her days are filled with cooking, sewing, prayer, and the quiet strength expected of the frontier woman. This is a household where scripture is read aloud, where morality is taught before letters, and where a child learns early that life is fragile, but that your purpose matters. Denton, Texas in 1892 is a place of beginnings. Rail lines are inching closer and closer to the town. Schools are starting. The old frontier is kind of fading away, but its values are remaining. And those values are self-reliance, faith, and a belief that God is actively shaping the future, even here in this little modest Texas town. And in that one small home, a newborn baby takes his first breath, unaware that that world will soon demand courage far greater than this quiet place had ever known. By the years leading up to the 1920s, the path of Hubert Sone is already being quietly shaped. Long before he boards a ship or learns another language, he is formed within the Southern Methodist tradition. That's a stream of American Christianity where discipline, duty, and devotion are woven really tightly together. This, in the late 1800s and early 1900s, is a faith that prizes structure, moral seriousness, and above all, obedience to God's call. These are the years when overseas missions dominated the church's imagination. Missionary journals circulated from hand to hand. Missionary speakers filled pulpits and revival tents, telling stories of distant lands and unfinished work. For young men like Hubert, the world feels both vast and urgently close. The shadow of World War I still lingers. The war has shaken confidence in Western progress and it's left many Christians searching for meaning beyond national borders. And out of all of that delusionment rises a renewed evangelical urgency. If the world can collapse so quickly, then the gospel must move faster still. The time feels short and the stakes are eternal. China, especially, looms large in the Methodist imagination. It's spoken of as a civilization at a crossroads. It's ancient and proud, unsettled, and open in ways it's never been before. Politically unstable, social upheaval, and spiritual searching are all a combination to create what the missionaries describe as a decisive moment for a Christian witness. To hesitate would be to miss God's timing. Hubert Sone's call to mission field didn't come as one sudden voice from heaven. It was more of a steady pressure, starting all the way back in his classrooms as a child. He heard it in the classrooms, in the pulpits, in prayer meetings, in missionary reports that his parents would read. Like many of his generation, he came to believe that obedience means going, and that faithfulness may require leaving everything familiar behind. It's April of 1920, and the shoreline of the United States begins to slip behind the Sones as their ship turns toward the Pacific. For Hubert Sone, now commissioned by the Southern Methodist Church, this is not simply a change of address. It's crossing, history. 1 month later, in May, the couple, Hubert and Helen Sone, arrive in Shanghai, a city alive with noise, commerce, and tension, where East and West were colliding at every street corner. China in the 1920s was a nation in transition. The Qing dynasty had collapsed. The early Republican period had brought hope, but not stability. Warlords competed for power. Students protested. Old centuries were breaking apart. Foreigners were no longer automatically welcomed, and missionaries felt that shift immediately. Suspicion runs deep, but doors did remain open to schools, to hospitals, and to a quiet work of Christian teaching. The Methodist presence here is not new. The Methodist Church South opened its mission in Shanghai in the late 1840s, and this is where Hubert and Helen Sone step in, joining a long but increasingly fragile legacy of missionary work. To prepare, Hubert and Helen study Chinese and immerse themselves in language and culture. Soon they are assigned to help build a new Methodist mission station. It's patient work, relationships before sermons, and trust before theology. Then in 1920, the urgency sharpens. Northern China is gripped by famine. Hubert travels to the Shandong province, driving a rice truck from village to village. He doesn't have a pulpit, doesn't have a classroom. He has sacks of grain for desperate families. And as he gives them hope and food, he also gives them the gospel. This is the gospel embodied in action. But the work takes its toll, and eventually, Helen and Hubert return to the United States. Back in America, Hubert begins a season of intense study, and by 1926, he's earned both a Bachelor of Divinity and a Master of Arts. And in 1927, he completed both degrees at the Southern Methodist University. So his time in America wasn't a retreat from mission. It was more of retooling and educating for what lied ahead. In 1928, the couple returned to China, and they were appointed as superintendent of the institutional church in Huzhou, overseeing ministry at a time when the ground beneath China was shifting. 5 years later, in 1933, he was called to teach at a theological seminary, known today as the Nanjing Union Theological Seminary. While he was there, he taught Mandarin, English, Hebrew, and he shaped future Chinese churches leaders, even as the political storm was gathering. It's the summer of 1934, and the Sones as a couple are continuing to teach. Hubert is teaching language, and his wife is teaching first and second grade. Together they're living kind of between cultures. They never truly feel at home in China, and yet they're so deeply committed to China. What makes their story so unique is that it's not a story of dramatic conversion or instant success. The reason that the Sone family was successful as missionary was that they endured. They continued believing that God's work would continue, even if history was feeling unstable, and they chose to stay when it would be easier to leave. When we look at China in the 1920s, we don't see a lot of public victories, but the missionaries who were there, like Hubert and Helen Sone, their mission work was one of silence, humility, and just hard work. Those years in China were dominated by language study, cultural immersion, and often demanding expectations placed on them by the Methodist missionary movement. Remember, Chinese is not learned casually. It has to be memorized tone by tone, character by character. A single mispronunciation can change the meaning entirely. Progress is slow and often discouraging. Days are spent listening more than speaking, learning when to bow, when to remain quiet, when words matter and when they don't. The cultural adjustment was so challenging. Western assumptions don't translate easily. Relationships move at a different pace. Respect is learned patiently. Hospitality is formal. Honor is important. And Helen and Hubert learn that effective ministry here is not going to come from importing their methods from America's evangelism. First, they had to learn how Chinese people work. They watched how families gather together, how elders speak, how grief is expressed, and how hope survives. Year after year, as they send reports back to the mission board, they don't send home any news about conversions. There's no dramatic stories for missionary newsletters. Their stories are about shared meals, crowded streets, quiet classrooms. But what was happening was that a foundation was being laid. But by the mid-1920s, the long season of preparation did begin to bear fruit. Hubert Sone began to become fully immersed in the church's daily work. He was preaching and teaching, and slowly a faithful local congregation began to take root. What Hubert began to see was that the goal in China should no longer be permanent foreign leadership. Hubert began to have a growing conviction that the church in China needed to be Chinese-led. It needed to be rooted in local communities. It needed to be shaped by local culture. It needed to be sustained by indigenous pastors and teachers. Schools were opened, Bible training was expanded, and leadership was nurtured quietly and deliberately. Hubert Sone saw that his role in China was less to be a pastor and a preacher, and more to be a mentor for the Chinese pastors, mentoring rather than controlling, and teaching, not directing. The success of the mission was no longer measured by how visible missionary is, but how confidently local believers could carry the work themselves without the missionary. By the late 1920s, the atmosphere in China had changed again, and this time the shift was unmistakable. Nationalism was rising, and with it, a growing suspicion of foreign influences. For missionaries like Hubert and Helen Sone, the work didn't stop, but it became heavier, more complicated, and more cautious. But perhaps that is why God had led Hubert to make sure that the churches were strong with indigenous Chinese leaders. Then nationalist forces began to unify the country and end the warlord rule. Political slogans filled the streets. Foreign institutions were questioned. Missionary compounds, once seen as a place of learning or aid, now became viewed as symbols of Western intrusion. For many missionaries, they felt a sudden change, welcomed and loved one day, and watched with suspicion the very next day. And this unrest forced a reckoning within the mission itself. Old strategies could no longer work. Missionaries realized that the Chinese pastors and the Chinese teachers and the Chinese evangelists had to step forward. They were no longer the assistants, they were the leaders. The church in China needed to belong to China, or it would not survive. And for Hubert, this confirmed everything he'd been saying for years. Trust mattered more than titles, and presence mattered more than power. The mission board began to take what he had been doing for many years, to move and work humbly, to go unrecognized, and to support a church that's learning to stand on its own. And this is when the Chinese church became not a foreign church transplanted onto Chinese soil. It became an indigenous Chinese faith rooted deeply enough to endure the political storms that were still coming. Then came the 1930s. Across China, uncertainty hardened into fear. Looming over everything in China was the threat of the Imperial Japanese Army. And for missionaries like Hubert and Helen, the work now was no longer about expanding their mission. It was about endurance. It was about staying alive. And this is when the mission strategy adapted and changed. Evangelism gave way to preservation. Churches that were already planted had to be sustained and kept going. Chinese pastors had to be strengthened, not supervised. Christian witness now meant staying present in a world that felt as if it was unraveling all around them. And then, July 1937, war became unavoidable. And by August 15th, Japanese air raids strike. And although school continued, classes were interrupted by sirens, and lectures were often abandoned as the students would run for the air raid shelters. By November 1937, the Japanese had captured Shanghai, and the danger was now unmistakable. Hubert sends Helen and their children to Mount Morgan. This was a place that was relatively safe, but he stayed behind, in the area that was currently being bombed by Japan. At the United States Embassy in China, a grim meeting is held. Officials warn of looting soldiers. Foreigners are urged to leave immediately. If necessary, they would be evacuated by ropes over the city walls. One by one, attendees explain whether they will go or stay. Hubert is in that meeting, and he speaks plainly. His responsibilities at his church make it necessary for him to remain. On December 9th, 1937, Japanese forces launch their full assault on the area. Missionaries take refuge, moving into Pearl S. Bunk's home. Then, on December 12th, the USS Paine, escorting Americans to safety, is sunk by the Japanese aircraft. The news of that comes to Helen and her children. They all assume that Hubert is aboard that ship. But he is not. He chose to stay. He becomes one of 14 Americans and one of just 27 Western nationals who remain as the city falls around them. On December 13th, 1937, Japanese troops entered the city, and what follows is remembered as a Nanjing massacre. Historians estimate that as many as 300,000 civilians were shot, bayoneted, or burned. Tens of thousands of women, young and old, even children, were raped and then mutilated. There is no safe place. There is no refuge that is untouched. And Hubert Sone is there while all of this happens, and he writes down everything he sees. His letters make it out of the city, and today we have copies of those letters. He recorded the horror. Women who were raped openly in the streets, and any who resisted were bayoneted. Children killed because they were crying. Refugee girls assaulted again and again. Streets littered with bodies. And the river carrying away the dead bodies. And what was Hubert doing? He rides his bike through the city. He sees the dying along the road. He sends survivors to hospitals by ambulance. He watches civilians taken in groups, sometimes 10, 50s, or hundreds, machine gunned and bayoneted, and their bodies burned and thrown into pits. His car is stolen, and he's left with no way out of the city. On December 23rd, 2 Japanese soldiers enter the seminary property. They tear down the American flag. One is drunk, and they demand to seize the house. When Sone refuses, they strike him, shout at him, and drag him into the streets. Only after he signs a statement allowing them to occupy the property do they release him. Through all of this terror, through exhaustion and grief, Sone remains in the city, not as a conqueror, not as a foreign authority. He's there as a Christian presence in the middle of human collapse. The gospel he once preached in classrooms is lived out in endurance, in a refusal to abandon the vulnerable, in a testimony written with trembling hands. This is not the end of his story, but it's the moment when faith was stripped of any comfort and belief stands alone against complete darkness and evil. In the chaos of 1937, as Shanghai burns and Nanjing braces for the impact, an idea resurfaces. Just months earlier, a French Catholic priest had helped establish a civilian safety zone. Against all odds, it had worked, and thousands were spared. In November 1937, the Nanjing Safety Zone began to take shape, not by governments or armies. Civilians put it together. And on November 22nd, the remaining foreigners in the city, missionaries, professors, doctors, and business leaders, organized into what they called the International Committee for the Nanking Safety Zone. Unlike Shanghai, the Japanese never promised to respect this zone. Still, on December 8th, the committee issues an open letter urging civilians to flee into the safety zone. And they come, tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands. Ultimately, over 90% of Nanjing's population crowd into the narrow space, believing and hoping it might restrain the violence outside. And within this fragile refugee camp, Hubert Sone takes on a critical responsibility. He becomes the chairman of the property of committee of the Nanjing Theological Seminary. He's also appointed Associated Food Commissioner for the safety zone. He drives rice trucks, delivering food from camp to camp. He sees the faces of the starving. He hears the stories of those who barely escaped. And he writes quietly and urgently of what's unfolding. Now, some people believe that the arrival of the Japanese troops is going to restore order, but that illusion shatters immediately. Instead, they get robbing, looting, torture, rape, murder, and burning. Hubert wrote this in one of his letters: "The city has become a living hell." But he doesn't remain a witness from the distance. When soldiers are assaulting civilians, he intervenes. More than once, he's beaten by Japanese soldiers because he's protecting women and children. And he writes protest letters to the Japanese embassy, to the United States embassy, and also through his missionary correspondence to America. He tries to alert the outside world of what's happening. On February 18th, the administrative director, George Fitch, leaves, and Hubert is elected to take his place. And the weight is immense. He's in charge now of food distribution, refugee protection, negotiations with occupying forces, documentation of the atrocities, all while violence is continuing day after day. And through it all, his wife Helen and their 2 children are remaining many, many miles away, cut off, believing at times that Hubert was already gone, that maybe he'd been evacuated. More than likely, he was probably dead. But Hubert stays, not because he believes he can stop the massacre, but because somebody has to remain. The safety zone did not end the horror, but it did save lives. Then, in 1939, amid the ruins and grief of the war, the Chinese government honored Hubert Sone and 13 other Americans with one of the highest civilian awards for valor, the Order of the Blue Jade. It's sometimes called the Star of the Jade Order. and sometimes it's called the emblem of the blue jade. The name matters less than the reason. They were honored for humanitarian courage, for staying when others fled, for protecting civilians, for choosing compassion amid atrocity. Hubert's medal arrives in a black box, smooth and solemn. Inside, red silk cushions the award. On the lid is a personal touch. The Chinese character for Song, his name rendered in another language. But he can't display it or speak about it publicly. Years later, before leaving China in 1951, Hubert makes a quiet, deliberate decision. The political landscape has changed, and suspicion follows anything connected to the old foreign presence. And carrying such a award could invite danger. So the medal is discarded, not in bitterness or in shame, but because of practicality. However, in a letter to his parents, Hubert explains what the medal looks like and why he could not keep it. And he even draws it out by hand. The whole thing, the medal, the pin, the box. A visual memory was mailed across the ocean to the United States. And then he let the award go. 2 years later, on May 3, 1941, the Huberts board the SS President Pierce for what was meant to be a temporary furlough. The family sails east, arriving in the United States on May 21st, believing that they will return soon to China. The family settles in Chicago. Life is slow. Hubert enrolls in a doctoral program at the University of Chicago, and his life turns once again to study, language, and theology. Then, December 7th, 1941, the United States enters World War II, and the return to China is indefinitely postponed. Hubert and Helen don't realize that their years in China are over, that the country they stayed for and bled for and served through its darkest hours is soon unreachable. In 1946, when the war finally loosens its grip on the world, World War II is ended, and across oceans, ruined cities, people begin the slow work of returning to homes, to callings, and to unfinished lives. And the Hubert family returned back to Nanjing. They come back to the city they knew well, but now they can't even recognize it. It carries the scars of occupation and violence. Buildings stand, but they're damaged. Families are fractured. Hunger is everywhere. But amongst all that brokenness, they find resolve. The churches that they left are open. Classrooms are full. Because he had left the indigenous people and allowed them to be the owners of the churches, they've remained even when the missionaries left. Hubert begins teaching and preaching in local churches. He also returns to his relief efforts, moving again amongst the people that he loved. Helen Sone also steps back into ministry, offering music lessons, small acts of beauty in a city long familiar now with terror. And now, in the city, notes and hymns echo rooms that once were filled with air raid sirens. And for children especially, music becomes a reminder that something gentle does still exist in the world. But by 1948, the situation in China had deteriorated again. Civil conflict drives waves of displacement. Refugees flood into the city, desperate and hungry. And once more, Helen and Hubert respond not with big speeches or sermons, but with logistics. And they begin to feed 15,000 refugees. They're organizing food and distribution. They're cooperating in the city. It's exhausting and unglamorous work. There's no medals, no ceremonies. There's just lines of people, bowls of rice, and the daily decision that tomorrow we're going to show up again. The story of Hubert and Helen Sone is not one of a single heroic moment. Their lesson is about enduring, about returning again and again to places marked with suffering and choosing to serve and suffer alongside the Chinese people. On October 1st, 1949, the future of China changed in one single declaration. Mao Zedong declares the founding of the People's Republic of China. For foreigners, and especially for missionaries, the message is unmistakable. The world they have known is now closed. Immediately, the United States suspends diplomatic ties. In 1950, the ambassador is recalled. American citizens are urged to leave China. Then in June, another war ignites. The conflict of the Korean Peninsula becomes international with the United States Security Council Resolution 83, and the United States enters the Korean War. Suspicions are hardening. Borders are tightening and time is running out. On December 2nd, 1950, Hubert submitted a request for an extra visa to the new government. The process is slow and deliberately uncomfortable. Some missionaries receive permission, but Hubert and Helen do not. Instead, Hubert is informed that their case has been sent to Beijing for further consideration. Weeks stretch into months. Each day carries a quiet fear that approval may never come. Finally, in April 1951, permission is granted, but at a cost. Much of what the family owns is confiscated. Every bit of U.S. currency they have, even his glasses, his radio, all taken. On April 12th, the Sones arrive in Hong Kong. They are the last American missionaries to leave China. A chapter that began with hope, survived war, endured revolution, finally comes to a close. A month later, on May 8th, 1951, they board the SS President Wilson and sail for San Francisco. They will never again return to China. But their story doesn't end. After just 1 year in the United States, they accept a new assignment, this time in Singapore. At the Trinity Theological College, Hubert begins teaching theology to a new generation shaped by a different post-war world. Over the next 9 years, he becomes not only a faculty member, but the dean and eventually principal of the college. He preaches in local churches. He helps guide the Methodist Church. His work is quieter, but no less faithful. Hubert and Helen's calling was never confined to one nation. When one door closed painfully and finally, another opened, and once again they stepped into it, carrying the lessons they learned. This is what faithfulness looks like. It's answering the call wherever it leads, and staying as long as God allows you to stay. By 1961, the long road of mission service finally brings them home. After 41 years of ministry, years marked by classrooms, refugee camps, sermons, air raid sirens, Hubert and Helen return to Texas. They are retired, but not really. For the next 9 years, they continue to preach in churches across the region in Texas, lecturing on the missionary work in Asia, telling stories not of themselves, but of the Chinese pastors, of the Chinese students, of the Chinese refugees, and the colleagues who are still there today. Those who hear him notice something striking. He has no bitterness. He has no self-importance. Hubert speaks with clarity, restraint, and authority, shaped by decades of witnessing both the best and the worst of humanity. As he's speaking, China is no longer a place that missionaries can go to. He's no longer telling people to get up, go to China as missionaries. Now he's telling them to pray for the Chinese churches being led by the Chinese pastors and the Chinese schools with the Chinese students who are carrying on the church in China. On September 6, 1970, Hubert died in Fort Worth at the age of 78. There were no headlines. There was no big public ceremonies marking the enormity of everything he had witnessed or the lives he had shaped. In fact, to this day, very few people even know who Hubert Sone is. But his legacy was not measured in big moments. His legacy is in letters that he wrote under fire. His legacy is in rice delivered to starving refugees, in students he trained to lead a church that would outlast him. It's in a medal that he chose not to keep. His life reminds us that faithfulness is rarely loud and often costly. Faithfulness is staying when leaving would be safer. Faithfulness is teaching when the future is uncertain, and trusting that obedience matters even when history turns against you. Hubert L. Sone never became a household name. His story isn't preserved in best-selling biographies or dramatic memorials. There's no movies made about his life. Yet, he represents an entire generation of missionaries who lived in this fragile space between World War I and World War II, between the confidence of the 19th century missionary movement and the painful birth of a more indigenous, resilient church. The Chinese church was forged by war, revolution, and expulsion. The missionaries arrived, believing they were going to build something that would outlast them, and they left, knowing that the church would survive without them. So what can we learn from his life? First, faithfulness matters more than visibility. Hubert did not seek prominence. He stayed when leaving would have been safer. He served when he didn't really have any success that could be measured. Second, presence is a form of witness. His greatest sermons were not preached from pulpits. They were lived out in refugee camps, in safety zones, in classrooms, in city streets. And this reminds us that sometimes the most powerful testimony is simply refusing to abandon the suffering. And third, the goal of the mission was not control. He understood that the church in China had to become Chinese to survive. So he helped train the leaders and then stepped aside. The success of his work was not that he remained, but that the faith endured after he was forced to leave. And finally, obedience may require letting go. He discarded the medal. He left the country he loved. He never returned to the place that shaped him, yet he also didn't cling to bitterness. He trusted that God's work was larger than his role. Hubert Sone's life asks the church a quiet question. Will we remain faithful if we have no influence? Will we serve when history turns against us? Will we stay when the cost is high? And will we leave when obedience requires it? Will we follow the legacy of Hubert, one marked with endurance? And in today's world that prizes speed and success and recognition, going viral, the greatest social influence, these lessons of endurance and humility are what the church needs. In our next episode, we're going to move to India and explore the life of George Sherwood Eddy, who started out amazing, but became intertwined with the modernist movement of the 1920s and 30s. His life is a lesson for us and a warning for us. So come back next Monday to hear that story. If you enjoyed today's episode, make sure to subscribe on YouTube or your favorite podcast app so you don't miss an episode. We release new content every Monday. And don't forget to check out our website at lauraleesiemens.com for more information and additional resources. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week as we continue our journey through the incredible history of the church.